Welcome to Sakshi TV's special immigration show with attorney Ms. Prashanthi Reddy. From law offices of Prashanthi Reddy, please note that Sakshi TV now has 3 immigration shows every week on Tuesday at 3 p.m. EST with attorney Ms. Sheila Murthy, Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. EST with attorney Ms. Prashanthi Reddy in English, and on Friday at 6 p.m. EST with Banu Ilinda. Please tune in to ask your questions. If you are an immigration attorney and would like to join our special shows, please email us at usa.com or 866-725-7441. Before we begin the show, please note that the information provided on this show is not legal advice and for general information purposes only. Sakshi TV or its agents will not be responsible for use of information. If you need any specific legal advice, please contact the attorney directly. Hello Prashanthi Reddy Garu, welcome to the show. Can you please provide us information on your law offices and law practices and your experience?
Yes, so I'm located in Midtown Manhattan in New York City, and I have over 20 years of experience in immigration law.
Okay. Today's topic is about F1 visa update. We will continue the knowledge session along with the news and updates on latest immigration, followed by Q&A session. Before we get into this topic, can you call us on the numbers on the screen for questions related to immigration and also ask the tips? Hello, Mrs. Prashanthi Reddy.
Okay. Hi, how are you, Shivani?
I am doing great. I hope you're doing well too.
I am, thanks.
Yeah. So today's topic is F1 visa updates. Can you please explain what is an F1 visa and how is it useful to the students?
Well, an F1 visa is a student visa. So unless you have an F1 visa, you cannot come and study in the US as a full-time student. So if you want to be a full-time student, you have to be on F1. You could also be on some other statuses and study, which such as a H4. Or some other dependent visa such as a L2, but the main way that foreign students come to the US is the F1 or the M1 visa. M1 is not that popular, but the F1 is pretty much what 99.9% of the students come on.
Okay. Can you please explain us about the initial visa process which should be done in one's own country?
I guess the visa process is basically the DS. They have to fill out the visa forms, and us immigration attorneys here in the US are not very much involved with the visa process, as the consulates don't allow US attorneys to represent clients at the consulate. But in general, you have to show that you do not have the intent to immigrate in order to get an F1 visa, and of course you have to meet the other requirements. You have to have an I20, college admission, pass all the necessary exams such as a GRE or GMAT or TOEFL, and of course pass the interview. And you have to be able to convince them, number one, that you do not have the intention of immigrating, and also show that you are actually have received admission in a recognized school, and that you intend to do what you're saying you're going to do, which is you don't plan to come to the US and work in a gas station, but you plan to be a full-time student. So you have to convince them of that. So that's about it. And of course you have to show that you have strong ties to your home country. And in order to show strong ties to your home country, usually they ask for family ties. So who do you have? Who are you leaving behind in India that you have to go back to? So if you say that your parents are there, your siblings are there, then in India, then that shows strong family ties. They also ask for financial means. They want to make sure that you have the means to support yourself once you're in the US, because you're not allowed to work in most situations on an F1 visa. And there are some situations where you can work, and we can talk about that later. But in general, they want to make sure that you have the ability to support yourself, which is boarding and lodging, and also you have the ability to pay your tuition fees. So usually they look at your bank statement, or if someone is pledging that they'll support you, they might ask for an affidavit of support from them. So these are some of the criteria that the consular officer looks at when they decide to give you an F1 visa.
We have a caller from Chicago. His name is Santosh. Hello, Mr. Santosh. You can ask your question now.
Hey, hi, ma'am. My name is Santosh. I'm from Chicago. I have a quick question. Like this is regarding the AOS. I submitted my AOS on August 12th, 2021, and I'm waiting for my biometrics got completed on September 16th, and I'm just curious to know like how long will it take the process to get the updates to USCIS?
Unfortunately, there is no timing or time frame that we can give you for adjustment of status applications, especially after the multiple applications that were filed last October. Everything has been backlogged, and also due to COVID, things have been backlogged, and many other reasons. USCIS is short-staffed and doesn't have the funds. So everything is a mess at USCIS right now. Therefore, it's difficult to give processing times. But in general, a 485 is supposed to take 12 to 14 months for process, presuming your visa number is current. But we have seen that that has not been happening, and they're very, the processing times have become very disparate, meaning that it's not the same in every case. In some instances, the 485 or the green card is coming in like 6 months. In some instances, it's taking a long time for them to process it. It also seems to depend on which service center it's at or where it has been moved. So there are a lot of factors, and it's hard for one to say when exactly you will get your green card. But of course, we can say for certain that you won't get it unless your visa number is available. But even if it is available now, it has to be processed within while it is still available. So next month, for example, if the visa number retrogresses, then you're again stuck until the visa number becomes current again. So unfortunately, USCIS is taking their own time to process adjustment of status applications.
Thank you so much, Santosh, for calling in. Now, ma'am, now that you've explained about the I20, what is the difference between the I20 and DS2019?
So the I20 is an application form that is submitted by schools. So it's approval that is submitted by the school, granting you admission and giving the terms of admission, and telling you what major you've been admitted for and what the duration of the admission is. So without that, you cannot go to the consulate. So first step is to get an I20. In pre-COVID, it had to be signed in original, so it had to be mailed from the university to you. Now, email versions, soft copy signature versions are acceptable, so you'll most probably get your I-20 via email. And once you do that, then you have to go to the consulate website, and on their website you have to fill out the DS form, and pay the visa application fee. So that's basically a visa application form. The I-20 is issued by the university, and that's a college admission form, really. So, with all this information that I had informed you about, you would then have to apply online, fill out the DS form. The questions in the form, again, I don't know exactly point to point what the questions are, but usually they are about, your address. Do you have any persons in the US that you know? Are there any immediate relatives that you have in the US? They're trying to fish for information on basically intent. So there are a couple of questions with reference to that, and the name of your university, etc., etc., address that you're going to be using once you're in the US, where you're going to be living. So these are the questions that are usually asked in the DS form.
So for the viewers, if you have any more questions, you can please call on to the number shown on the screen. Now ma'am, what is SEVIS 1901 form?
So CVIS is basically a website that is used to monitor the status of a student. That's the CVIS website, and there are several forms on that website. So what we have to remember is that your status should always be current on that CVIS website via those forms. So at any given point of time, it is the university that will maintain your CVIS forms and the information on the CVIS website. And if they don't do so, if they don't update it, you will automatically fall out of status. So there are many instances in which the DSO, or the designated student officer at the university that is in charge of foreign student admissions, they don't update your CVIS, or they don't enter correct information into the CVIS, and you fall out of status, and then you have to file an application with USCIS. So the CVIS is pretty much like a student portal where all the information of that student is updated by the university and monitored by USCIS. So every time there's some change, there's a transfer, there's a new I20, everything has to be updated into CVIS.
Now we have a new caller. Her name is Vani. Hello Vani, you can ask your question now.
Hey, hi. I have a couple of questions for you.
Yeah?
So, our project June 2013, we have our education.
Sorry Vani, your voice is not audible. Can you be more clear?
Am I audible now?
Yeah, you're audible now.
Thank you. Actually, we have filed our I-485 in August. This month, our priority date was correct in August. I just wanted to, and our biometrics were done on September 6th. So, what are the chances of we get the green card by October end?
I'm so sorry Vani.
But I'll try to answer the question. I think I got the gist of it.
Yeah.
Vani is basically saying that her 485 was filed and she's hoping that she will get it by the end of October. And she's asking what are the chances of getting her 485 approval by the end of October. So Vani, your guess is as good as mine. I don't know what your chances are. It depends on how quickly USCIS processes your case. Again, I was just telling the other caller that there doesn't seem to be any marker for cases as to when they'll get processed. It's not necessarily first in, first out. There's a disparity in processing of cases. They're not being processed. And also all cases went at the same time in October. There were, thousands of applications filed on the same day. So I guess it's hard. They will treat all those applications, I guess, as received at the same time, most probably. That's what they seem to be doing. But depending also on which service center it goes to, there's a disparity in the processing time. And also depending on whether you had an I-140 downgrade, those cases are definitely taking longer than the straight 485 cases. So it's anyone's guess, but we did hear that USCIS is processing 7,000 to 8,000 applications a month. They have really, for them, they are saying that they have sped up the processing of 485s because they are trying to process cases before the end of this month, actually, because next month is when the new fiscal year starts, and if they don't use up the visa numbers for this year, then they just go wasted, and then a new quota opens up next year. So as usual, they'll be wasting, most probably they would have wasted quite a few visa numbers because they were not able to process and use up those numbers on time. So I doubt they've used all the numbers, but they were speeding up. But I don't really know the answer to your question as to whether you will get it before that time or not.
Thank you. We have another caller. Hello, can you hear us? Okay, it's Vani again. Vani, you can ask your question again.
Actually, our date became current in August visa bulletin. So we have applied our I-485 and advanced payroll and for EAD in August. So what are our chances of getting a green card by October end?
So I got your question and I answered it. I don't know. No one knows the answer to that question. Nobody can give you the answer to that question. If you filed in August, and even if your dates are current, there are a lot of people who filed in October, whose dates then became current. So obviously they will get priority over you. So it really, we have to presume that the people who filed earlier will get some priority over people who file later. So, I mean, as per what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing from my cases, there are a lot of cases that were filed last October and then became current and are still being processed and are not approved. So I guess your turn will come after them, which is not very good news, but that's the reality of it.
Thank you so much, Vani, for asking your questions. Now, ma'am, what are the financial and the academic certificates that should be submitted by the students to the visa office and the university?
So I think I've already mentioned about how we need to show that the person has the financial ability to pay the tuition fee, right? And with reference to academic certificates, as I mentioned, you might have to submit your proof that you actually qualify for that admission. And of course, you'll have to submit the results from whatever exams you're required to take, such as your TOEFL, GRE, GMAT, etc. And financial forms is basically your, bank statements to show that you have sufficient means to pay the tuition fee. It also could be property documents to show that you have, if you have disposable assets, of course, they look at mostly disposable assets rather than property documentation. So they usually look at bank statements, and they don't usually look at just the bank letter from the bank saying you have this much amount of money. They usually like to look at statements from the last 3 months or 6 months to see that you've maintained that money in the bank account, because a lot of people just put in money into the bank account for the visa interview and then take it out after that. So they have become wise to that, and that's why they're they look at the actual bank account. So or if you don't have the money and someone is sponsoring you, as I said, then they would look at an affidavit of support, and that sponsoring person's tax return or bank account or employment information.
Thank you, ma'am. This question has very, very much information. Now, the viewers can call on to the numbers that are shown on the screen. Now, ma'am, can you please explain what is on-campus employment and what are the guidelines that should be followed by the students while doing the on-campus employment?
So, on-campus employment is pretty much, the job has to be located on campus, meaning on the premises of the university. And every student is allowed, even without prior permission, 20 hours of on-campus employment. But they only have to work for that university or that educational institution that has given them admission. They can't work for another organization. I mean, it's possible to work in another location, but only if it is with an educational institution that has an affiliation to the institution that has offered you admission, such as like if you're working in a lab and the lab is located at an off-campus location, then that would definitely be still considered to be on campus. On campus is basically work that takes place at your school location, and it could be, for example, in your bookstore or in the cafeteria or in the library. It should be work that directly services the students, and it should not be something that doesn't directly service students, such as construction work. You can't be a construction worker. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, as I was saying, educationally affiliated off-campus locations also are allowed. And I was giving you the example of, research lab facility which could be off campus. So that's what on-campus employment is. The guidelines for the on-campus employment is that that job should not displace a US citizen or a permanent resident, which is interesting. It has to be only not more than 20 hours per week, so it can't be more than that. It can be full-time when there's no school, such as during summer or during annual vacation time, then you can work full-time, otherwise it has to be 20 hours. Students should report to their work and receive a certification letter to present at SSA, so the Social Security Administration, in order to receive a Social Security number. Now, as you all know, you can't get paid and you can't work unless you have a SS number. So once you get a job, then you have to submit an employment letter and then go to the Social Security office to get on campus to get a Social Security number. So those are some of the terms and conditions of on-campus employment.
Now that we've compared the on-campus, can you please explain us what is off-campus and again the same guidelines?
Right. So just a quick thing that I forgot to mention about on-campus employment is, the DSO is responsible for monitoring your on-campus employment. So the DSO has to inform the student as to, number of hours that the F1 may work, type of employment, how to maintain the F1 status, tax and social security implications. All these things are really maintained and advised by the DSO. So any questions you have in your school, you always go to the DSO. And in order to be eligible for on-campus employment, the student may begin working 30 days before the start of a program of study. So if you're, for example, undergrad program is starting on August 30th, you can actually start working on August 1st, as long as they inform the DSO that they're about to begin work. So that's one thing about on campus, and there's some restrictions also. So I think we covered the restrictions that you can't, for example, work as a construction worker. It has to be something that services the students. And an F1 student cannot work for a company that does not contract with the school, even if the work location is presently located on the school properties. For example, if there's some private vendor that's working on campus and doesn't have a direct contract with the school, such as a food vendor, a food truck, you can't go and work for that food truck. It's not considered to be on-campus employment because you're not being employed by the university. So though it's physically on campus, you're not allowed to do that. And of course, if there is, as I said, even if they are contracting with the university, sometimes you can't work for them if it's not providing services to the students, such as you can't do construction labor. So what else? Did we cover everything on campus?
Yeah, we covered everything off campus.
Okay. So what is your question now about off campus?
What is off campus and what are their guidelines? Are they similar to the on campus?
Off campus is basically work that is not done on campus. So under certain circumstances, work can be done other than for the university. Generally, as per the regulation, the university has to approve it, and it has to be due to some financial hardship. So either that, then you can apply to the university, get pre-approval for working off campus if you have financial hardship, and once you get the approval, then you can work for the employer that they have approved. If it's not financial hardship, then you can still join the CPT program, which is basically called Curricular Practical Training. So that is usually, that again, you have to have pre-approval of your university, and it has to be, there has to be a statement in your I20 which approves the CPT, and that is generally given when your work relates directly to your academic course of study. So for example, if you're doing a master's in computer science and you put in a CPT application for working with an IT company, it is obviously directly related to computer science, so you're allowed to work on a CPT, and that's really the gist of off-campus employment.
Okay. Ma'am, what is OPT, and is OPT and CPT the same thing?
So optional practical training is also can be off-campus employment, but it's not the same thing, because OPT is usually given after the completion of your course. Permission to work is given, and that can range from 1 year to 3 years. Regular post-completion OPT is 1 year, and that can be extended if you are working in the STEM field, which is science, engineering, math. So if you're working in the STEM field, you can get a further extension, and that's called STEM OPT extension. And a CPT, as I told you, is work that you can do off campus while you are studying. So it's done really parallelly to you take courses and then you're working as well.
What is a CAP gap and how does it occur?
So CAP gap is, we have actually a lot more about off-campus. Should we do a little bit more discussion
Yeah,
on
sure, we can do that.
off-campus employment?
Definitely, we can do that.
Because okay. So basically, as I said, off-campus employment is can be CPT or can be OPT, and as I said, you have to have prior approval for both. Now CPT, if you're taking CPT, there are a lot of repercussions of being on curricular practical training, and some of them especially are due to the fact that students are enrolling into CPT programs because their primary goal is to work and not study. So they're actually enrolling into an F1 to be able to get CPT, not the other way around. It's supposed to be the other way around, where CPT is really just incidental benefit that's given, but your main goal has to be to study. But it's now what's happening with the students who have completed their master's degrees and have not been able to change status to a H1 because of the H1B cap. We have a limited number of H1s that can be selected every year. It's 85,000. So a lot of students are not able to change to a H1 as soon as they complete their F1 because they don't get selected in the cap. So then what happens is they do a second master's, and they don't really need to do the second master's, but they do it so that they can continue or they can get a job, or they can continue working if they were working previously on CPT. And so it's become like a means for students to continue their jobs. So the USCIS is pushing back on CPT. So what happens is when they finally are able to get into the cap, and they file the H1, USCIS is sending out requests for further evidence, asking, especially for students who took CPT, and if you've taken especially day one CPT, that means you've taken CPT right from the beginning of your academic year and then continued throughout. So they're pushing back and they're asking questions as to why the CPT was necessary. Was the CPT an integral and essential part? Was the CPT related to what you were doing? So there's a list of questions and documentary evidence that is being asked. And sometimes the students are working in a completely different state from where they're studying. So there's questions asked as to how do you commute? Where are you actually living? If you're not living near the campus, then how are you going to school, or if you're not, or how are you working, depending on where you're living. So the student has to then show proof of how that he or she is attending in-person school. Of course, now with COVID, that's no longer a problem because you're allowed to attend online courses. But previous to COVID, only one online course could be taken per semester. So they would ask questions such as, how are you attending school in person? If so, how are you doing it? You're 1,000 miles away. So they're showing flight itineraries, they're showing records that they've rented a car, or they've rented an apartment or in a hotel at the university campus for the weekend, and they're showing that classes are only held on weekend. So, this is the kind of documentation that they're asking in a CPT process. So, just be aware of the repercussions of going on CPT. It's not that you can't do it, but there are some questions that will be asked. So you have to always make sure that you maintain your status. With reference to OPT, I think what needs to be said is that there are certain guidelines for OPT as well, and you have to meet those guidelines. If it's post-completion OPT of 1 year, you have to show that even if you are not paid, that you actually worked, even if you interned for a certain period of time. You're allowed some period that you're not working, but for that minimum period of time you have to work. Same with the STEM OPT. You have to show that it's actually paid employment, and you're allowed 90 days where you don't work, but the rest of the time you have to show that you worked. So and in order to file OPT, you have to file it within the 60 days grace period. If you don't file it within that time period, then you will not be able to file it later. So you'll have to figure out, another means, either leave the country or extend your F1, or if you missed the deadline for some reason or your application came back, you might have to file, an application for them to accept the late application. So, these are some of the things to keep in mind for a CPT. And another thing that I wanted to mention is also that, how many hours, the question would be, how many hours can you work on CPT or OPT? So there's actually no restriction unlike the 20 hours on-campus restriction, there's no real restriction on how many hours you can work for a CPT. And of course, there's no restriction for OPT at all because you're not really going to school, you're just working. That is a training period. So that's a distinction between the on-campus and the off-campus.
Now, ma'am, what is the maximum duration of OPT?
So as I was saying, you can get, it's 1 year is post-completion OPT, and then you can get 3 years for a STEM extension. So that's the maximum period that you can be on OPT.
Now, can we discuss again about the cap gap?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so what is a cap gap and how does it occur?
So a cap gap is an artificial process that has been created by USCIS so that there is no harm that is done so that the students don't fall out of status when the H1 has been filed, but it's being filed for a start date of October 1st. So as we know, and for those of you who don't know, usually H1s are filed 6 months in advance of the start of the fiscal year. The fiscal year starts October 1st, but they allow H1s to be filed 6 months before, so April 1st. And so for that, as of the date of filing, the student has to show that he or she is in status. And before the cap gap law came into the picture, the student had to show that they continue to be status until the start date of the H1, which could only be October 1st. So now what has happened is USCIS has come up with a policy whereby if you have filed the application while you were in status, As long as you show a copy of the filed application or the receipt to your DSO, that status that you had when you filed the application will continue until October 1st. So it's an artificial status that they've just temporarily extended for the period that your H1 is not valid. So that is gap. In order to cover the gap between the H1B start period and the application, they've created this gap law.
The viewers watching the show can please call on to the number shown on the screen. Now, ma'am, can a student who is in the gap period travel during this time?
So a student will need to obtain an updated I20 from his or her designated school official, the DSO. And that I20 is the only document that a student will have to show proof of continuing status. And the student should go to their DSO with evidence of a timely filed H1B petition, as I was saying, right?
Yeah.
And so if once they do that, then they will be designated as gap. And so proof of filing is pretty much just the UPS or FedEx or proof of mailing. So once they have, and a copy of the petition. So the student DSO will then issue an interim gap I20. And the gap I20 will be until say October 1st. And also the student CVIS records will have to be updated by the DSO. So if all this is done, then the student can travel. That is basically what the process that has to be done, so that the student continues status. So once all this is done, then the student, there's still an issue with the student traveling mainly because of this. Once you have obtained proof of status, in order to travel, remember you filed a change of status from F1 to H1. So when you file a change of status, the laws say that you cannot travel. So what will happen is your change of status application will get cancelled, and you will still get the H1, but your H1 will be for consular processing. So the change of status part of the application which you have asked for will not be approved. So then you'll have to go out of the country, get a visa, and come back in to activate your H1. So if you're willing to do that, then that's fine. So the short answer is no. It's better not to travel. But if simply because you filed a change of status application. But there's another thing to remember here. It's a little more complicated than it seems, since it depends on when you want to travel. So if you're traveling before October 1st, since your H1 has not yet started, it is not considered to be the change of status rule that we usually talk about is not applicable. So you can actually leave and come back on an F1, and it's as if nothing has happened. As long as you do this before October 1st. After October 1st, then you will basically lose your change of status application benefit, and you'll have to leave the country and come back on a H1. So it really depends on when you're traveling. So the answer is yes and no, depending on when you're traveling.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Now, coming back to the application process again, what are some tips and tricks that you want to suggest, and what are some steps that you want the students to avoid completely while applying the visa?
I think we've kind of did a checklist of that in the beginning. We were talking about the do's and don'ts, basically. So we have to figure out what the essential elements are in order to get a visa. And so the essential elements are, you have to show the financial, that you have the means, meaning the financial means to cover your entire tuition period, or at least the first semester tuition. you have to have you should not have an intent to immigrate to the US, right? And you have to show that there's no fraud involved, which means you have good intent. You have the intent to actually go and do what you're supposed to do, what you're saying you're going to do, which is studying in the University of Arkansas or wherever you're studying. So as long as you're able to prove these elements, you have to submit documents to prove those elements. So how do you, for example, if you have all your family in the US, your parents, your spouse, everybody's in the US, and you're the only person here and you're applying for an F1, and your family members are all US citizens, it's unlikely that you're going to get a student visa, because you're not able to show family ties in India, and you most probably won't be able to show that you have the intent of returning because your entire family is in the US. So these are some things to keep in mind. The other pointer that I had was about the finances. You really have to show that you have the finances to at least pay the first semester fee. You can't just put the money into the bank account and then take it out and get a letter from the bank official, because they will ask for to show that that amount has been there for a sustained period of time, because they usually ask for 3 to 6 months of bank account information. So it won't work if you put the money in and take it out. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also to keep in mind is make sure you research your university properly, that you don't go to a university that is not properly accredited, or go to a university that is under the radar of ICE officials. So go to the CVIS website and go to their list of accredited universities, because there is no point in going to a university that is not accredited, because it will not be considered by many employers once you finish the degree that you have. Your master's degree, for example, won't be counted by the employers sometimes if it's not accredited. And also for H1 purposes, if you're filing under master's cap, there's separate cap for master's degree holders, and it will not consider it to be, you will not under master's cap unless you go to an accredited university. So that's something to keep in mind. Make sure you go to an accredited university. And then, once you come to the US, there's so many do's and don'ts. There's just some common sense do's and don'ts, and some that are related to maintaining of your status. So the common sense ones are, very simple. Do what you're supposed to do. Follow the laws of the land. So don't get into a fight with someone, and then you'll be in trouble, because you might be, assault charges might be filed against you, which is a felony. And if so, there is a criminal offense against you, there's a criminal conviction against you, then you'll be deported. So make sure you don't get into any kind of trouble with the law. Don't work without authorization off campus. Don't work in the gas station or in the 7-Eleven. Go to school. Don't work in Dunkin' Donuts or wherever it is that students like to work. If you've been given admission to a university, you've been given an F1 visa in order to go to school, so that's what you're supposed to do. So there are a lot of common sense do's and don'ts.
Yeah. Mrs. Prashanthi Reddy, can you please explain us about F2 visa?
Yes, I think we have been talking about the F2 visa.
Yes.
Do you have a specific? So again, sorry for the technical glitch that we just had. I think we were talking about the cap visas.
Yes.
And we were talking about how the cap visa occurs, and
Yes.
How does a student covered under cap obtain
Yes.
proof? And I was saying that we get fresh I20 showing that the person is cap approved. So also there's people ask a lot of other questions with reference to F1s also, and caps. And one of the questions is, if a student was not in an authorized period of OPT on the date that the cap was filed, can the student work during the cap extension. So basically, as I said, at the time of filing the H1, whatever the person's status was at that time, that status freezes and continues until either the H1 gets approved or October 1st. So if the person was not in an OPT when at the date that the H1 was filed on April 1st, then the person cannot then be in an OPT during the cap period and cannot work on a post-completion OPT status. Then the other question is that people have is, after being granted the cap extension, if a student's H1 is rejected or denied or revoked or whatever it is the student then, what happens to that student? How do they get back into the status? Are they given some kind of a grace period? So the good news is, so basically the question here is that you filed the H1, you got that cap period under which you have status, and then what happens is your H1 gets denied. So then once you get the denial, then what is your status? That's the question. So such a student will have a 60 days grace period, and that 60 days grace period can either be used to get ready to leave the country, or you can file for admission to a different college during that 60 days grace and get back into an F1 status. Or you can go into some other status like a B2 status. So depending on what your situation is, you can remain in the country by filing a change of status, or what you can do is, you can file an appeal on your H1 for sure, and maybe it'll get approved, or you can transfer to a different university, and that will help as well. And that can be done. You have 60 days to do that. Now, another question about the cap is, can a student travel outside the US during a cap period? So that I think we already discussed.
Yes, we did.
That it's both yes and no. It really depends on, the situation, whether the student is traveling before October 1st or after October 1st.
Now again, can you please give us a little information about F2?
F2, okay.
Yes.
So F2 is a dependent of F1. So if you have a minor child under 21, or if you have a spouse, they can travel with you on an F2 status. So as long as you are in status, your dependents will also be in status automatically. And in order to file an extension of the F2, because if you have to file a change of status, then there is the form that has to be used is the I-539. But generally, the status of the F2 continues if your status continues. So it's duration of status. There's no ending period really. There's no ending date on the I-94. It'll just say DS, which is duration of status. And an F2 cannot work. So whereas other dependents, there are other dependents that can work, like a H4 in some situations, which is a dependent of a H1, they can work. An L2, who are dependents of an L1, they can work, but an F2 cannot work. But an F2 person can go to school. So your children can go to school, and your spouse can go to school as well on an F2, as long as it's not full-time school.
Thank you so much, ma'am. You gave us so much information, and I'm pretty sure many students are going to get much information from you. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you. Thanks
you so much. This is Sakshi TV Live, and you're watching me, Shivani Raj. Thank you.